cost of beef is going through the roof. And in my search to find a place to kind of put down roots and build, I've been looking into, my dream has been to be somewhat of a cattle farmer, I would say. Nothing too major. Don't want to be like a rancher or anything where I've got hundreds of thousands of acres and hundreds of heads of cattle. But I definitely want to be able to raise my own food, raise my own beef. And the reality of it is, with me looking at 5 acres or somewhere in that range, me going and getting a couple of Angus, a couple of South Pole, a couple of Herefords, Red Devon, it doesn't make sense, right? Like that's not enough acreage to properly feed out and get to market weight those breeds of cow. And it's just because they're huge, man. Those things run. I mean, a finished steer for an Angus runs about 1,400 pounds. And to feed that, you're going to need at least an acre plus, right? You're going to be able to rotate maybe an acre, but you're definitely going to need more space than what I'm going to be able to access for any given cow. And on top of that, you can't just buy one cow. If you buy one cow, you need to buy a couple because they're herd animals and that stress does kind of make its way into the meat. So, in doing my research, right, looking to see, hey, am I just going to give up the dream and go directly into, sheep farming? Am I going to kind of sort of stick with, the plan of just buying a bunch of land with some people or buying a plot of land separate from where I live? I've kind of seen, just a few acres farm before, and I know he's talked about Dexters and their size and things of that nature. I've also seen people like Homesteady, that family talking about like mini jerseys, and I've seen many Highlands, of course, all over social media, not for beef, but just as pets. And ultimately, I think going into the Dexter direction is going to be probably the most beneficial for me, given the size of the plot of land that I'm probably going to be on in that 5 acre, 3 to 5 acre range. But then in addition, I think it'll be good for a lot of homesteaders as well, right? Like when we really think about how much meat you get from a steer, right? You think about how large a Angus steer is. You're talking 400 pounds of meat after everything's been put into place. That's 400 pounds of meat. Most people only eat about 60 pounds of beef a year. I mean, like I don't even consider myself a large beef eater, even though I do eat a considerable amount of steaks and ground beef given my diet. But like even still, I have no need for 400 pounds, 500 pounds of beef because I have a small family and we don't eat beef like that. Not saying we wouldn't up our intake if we had our own cows, but ultimately it's just a lot of meat to have. You have to find a place to store it. You got to keep it from going bad, and I don't feel like the cost that you would have in order to, one, hold and take care of that steer. Let's say you're the one feeding it out. Or if you just buy a half a beef or a whole beef and split it with somebody, that's a lot of space. You got to get a deep freezer, things of that nature. And it's not saying that in any operation where you're doing any kind of meat production, you're not going to need a deep freezer or a cool room or anything like that. But at the same time, there's a big difference in 400 pounds of meat that you would get with your standard beef cattle versus maybe 200 or even less, depending on the size of the Dexter that you go with, right? Um, the other thing to think about is space requirements. Like I said, that's kind of the biggest crux of this whole nine. You could typically run 1 to 2 Dexters an acre, right? And that's not to say, hey, I've got 3 acres. I need to go ahead and divide them up and have it where I've got two per acre. It's more so if I need to rotate, which I'm going to be doing rotational grazing. If I need to rotate, I'm going to be able to utilize the size of the Dexter to my advantage. I can have smaller paddocks. I can rotate them more frequently on the small space that I have, and I can still get that impact to the soil. And it's kind of a stepping stone, right? And if you really think about it from a grand scheme, right? A Dexter cow being that small, you can possibly run it with sheep. You could possibly run it. I've seen people run Birchfield Farms in Ohio runs Red Devons and St. Croix sheep together. So think about running a Katahdin and a couple of Dexters together in a flirt, and now you're getting significant animal impact on the grass. You're getting ultra high density on that grass, and thus as they move on, that grass is going to grow back because it's had so much manure, so much urine, so much literal trampling impact on the grass that it's going to grow back quicker, right? You can implement all those things you see Joel Salatin and Greg Judy talking about within that flirt if you go with a smaller set of cattle on a smaller piece of land with, maybe two Dexters and a couple of, Barbados or Katahdin, or if you want to go Dorper, you can go Dorper sheep. The other thing to think about with, what I'm saying, the size of the Dexters is when you start talking about growing an operation, you can pretty much handle a Dexter a lot easier, I would say, than you could a larger breed of bull, right? Like if you think about how big these bulls get, if you think about how strong some of these bulls are, that danger aspect is not lightly taken, right? Like you got to think about if they go feral, if they get riled up and they want to attack something like that, you'll have an easier time. Not saying you're just gonna go out here and manhandle any Dexter at all, because it's still a big ball of muscle. But at the same time, there's a difference in, something topping out at around 900 pounds versus it topping around 2,000, maybe even more, depending on some of the genes that they've got coming down the pipeline right now. It's more of, I would say, a stepping stone into large ranching. You want to learn how to deal with cows, you want to learn how to operate a cattle farm or raise your own beef. Boom, you've got the opportunity to do so. And again, going to the size in terms of meat, not everybody needs a 10-ounce or a 15-ounce steak, right? Not saying you can't get that, because you can easily cut those steaks thicker, but I mean at the same time, the size of the actual cuts of the animal are also more controlled, right? Like it's not like you have to go in there, cut your steak in half, cut your ribeye in half or whatever, you know what I mean? Or you don't have to go invite your family over for every meal. Ultimately, the other pieces that comes down to is the cost aspect, right? When you think about your top, let's say the top four in the South, where I'm trying to head to, right? You've got your Angus, your South Pole, your Hereford, and then Murray's are starting to make a move. Dexter's and Devon's haven't really made their way to the South, but a Dexter, an open heifer for a Dexter runs $1,500 to $2,500, right? So that's a lot lower of a ceiling than your Hereford, which could run 31 to 4,500. And this is just for an open heifer. This isn't a bred heifer. This isn't a bull. This isn't anything with a pedigree. This is just your run-of-the-mill open heifer. You're looking at half the cost, because these things are half the size of your typical beef cattle. And again, with prices being high, if you're thinking about what you're getting in terms of beef output versus what you're putting in from money, from hay, from land, and things like that, you can almost cut your costs in half and still get a satisfactory product. You might not get the same amount of meat, but you don't need that same amount of meat, right? You're not running your operation for the sake of growing it to this huge, gigantic scale. You know what I mean? But if you think about the efficiency of your cost inputs to what you're getting on the back end, Dexter's seem to come out on top, specifically if you don't have a ton of acreage or access to a ton of acreage. Another key piece about Dexter's is they're probably one of the few beef breeds that are truly dual purpose, right? People eat Jerseys, people can eat Holsteins, even though I heard that it isn't good eating for the most part, even though it's still beef. But Dexters are one of the few breeds that gives you A2 dairy products. And anybody who knows anything about dairy, you understand like A1 is seemingly a little bit less digestible than A2. And that A2 protein setup or whatever seems to go down better than what a lot of people get with your typical milk that you get from like your Holsteins or whatever, right? And you're seeing it a lot more in stores now where they have those separate cases for the A2. It's a little bit more expensive, and that's just because it's a little bit more digestible. There's a little bit more work that goes into it, tracking the genetics, things of that nature. The other thing is it does have 5% butter fat, so you can make butter out of it. You can make cheeses, you can make kefir, you can make yogurt. So they perform not as high as like a dairy cow, because they do only give you 1 to 2 gallons per day of milk. But at the same time, if you were looking to go into that dairy side of things, it's not a hard way to get into it, because you're already growing it for beef. You could just kind of test out the dairy side, and once you've tested out the dairy side, if that's something you want to go into, then of course you could pursue something a little bit more dairy suited, like a mini Jersey or something like that. The Dexter is a homesteader's dream, I would say. And the reason I say that is, again, I'm working on a limited budget, right? Like you guys have seen my video, maybe you've seen my video about us house hunting, but it's not like I have $600,000 to invest solely into a cattle operation. Being able to take what I would consider a decent sized yard in 4 or 5 acres, a huge yard actually, and utilize that to get into the beef industry in terms of for my family, I think the Dexter kind of plays a perfect, or any mini cow for the most part, plays a perfect role in that, right? And as you guys know, I have said I won't ever do dairy, but now I actually have the option, right? Like it's not like I'm handicapped because I have these animals that aren't made for milk. It's more so I'm choosing not to use these animals for milk. And if I decide to change my mind, I can. As with all breeds, there are specific things you want to look out for, right? There are two basic lines of Dexters, right? You've got your chondro carriers and your long legs. And the long legs are typically just a smaller version of your standard beef cow. But the chondro is almost as if it's not almost as if the chondro is basically the Dexter has dwarfism, right? And with that, it can cause complications if you get two chondro carriers together and they breed. You can potentially get some stillbirths from that pairing, right? And I don't know the percentages in terms of how high those percentages are, but that is a known thing with Dexter's. Not to say that, you know what I mean, like it's a super deal breaker in any regard. If you're getting into it, of course, you want to make sure that you get those things tested, and you can pretty much spot them because they're a decent bit shorter than their long-legged counterparts. But at the same time, it's definitely something to look out for. The other thing to think about is it's still a cow. So, I mean, ultimately, you're going to have to make sure that you have the infrastructure in place. Like, even though it's fencing in a smaller area, you will need to fence them in. They're not like dogs. You're not going to call them and then they're just going to come. They are animals, they are livestock. So, you need to treat them as such. Of course, a positive is they seem to do very well on grass. There doesn't seem to be any issue with them fleshing out completely on grass. With them being an Irish breed, they seem to do very, very well on strictly grass. So you can basically get them to full fattening and slaughter weight, grass only. Of course, if you want to run grain, that's your prerogative. The other thing is they're known for their meat to have smaller fibers, which makes them naturally more tender. They are a docile breed, which is again going to the handling, like I was talking about. But ultimately, again, I think for a lot of us, as it pertains to us trying to get into the industry, trying to mitigate some of our costs, or even trying to start, businesses, going with the Dexter might be the way to go, right? You build up your experience with a smaller breed of cow, you help out your soil, running rotational grazing and practicing those techniques. And then as you maybe sell some beef or as you maybe get yourself a market, then you start to kind of ease into a larger breed of cow, be it a red Devon that's a little bit larger, a little bit more expensive, kind of the business plan, right? Like, and a lot of people I think start off into cattle, jumping into the big boys really early, and then they wash out because of how difficult it is and how much of a learning curve there is. Based off the cost, you have to make a profit. So now you're blowing up your costs versus you could easily come in, get a bull and a calf, or a bull and a cow, or whatever you want to get, right? Whatever your pairing is, get a couple of them, two or three, put them on your acreage, rotate them, slaughter them, learn the game, and then use that to start, right? And that's something I think I might wind up doing, is just taking 3 acres, 3 or 4 acres, getting one or two and rotating them on those three or four. And then as the grass shows itself, because again, in Mississippi, getting hay won't be a difficulty. I have people who can get me hay. So ultimately, as the technique is perfected and maybe I get into the art of understanding how to sell beef and things like that, I take that and use that to buy a bigger plot of land, get more cows, get bigger cows, or whatever it is I feel like I need to do based off the response. So again, just giving you guys kind of the understanding of where I'm coming from and what I'm thinking about with the acceptance of smaller acreage, right? One of the things I've talked about on TikTok a lot of times is, as a business person, your first mind is always the idea that you had, but you do want to be able to be malleable enough to pivot to whatever would be considered the next best thing, right? Or your next best option. And whether that means it goes from being full-size cattle to Dexter's, or it goes from cattle altogether to sheep, or just going straight down to chickens, you always want to be able to pivot and start at a specific place and then build from there, right? Work out some kinks, get a system in place, standardize everything, and then build from that, or be comfortable in that and settle in what you're doing and scale that, right? Because you don't always have to have every enterprise. But if you actually, and this is one of the things I definitely want to bring up, if you have Dexters, right? If you work with Dexters, have them or raise them or slaughter them, whatever, let us know in the comments, you know what I'm saying? Like some of the pros and cons that you've dealt with, right? How easy is it for you to get Dexters? What are the things that we should know? What are things that I've missed? Because again, I'm doing all this from my office in Virginia. So this isn't even on the land that I'm trying to get, right? So I have no experience, but definitely want to get some people who are experienced in not only working with cattle, but specifically Dexters. If you have any experience with those, put some tips for us in the comments for those of us who are actually going to start pursuing Dexters, because again, the more we learn and the more we grow with each other, the bigger the community will be and the better the community will be. Peace.